Chapter 4, The Most Important Man in the World. Luckily, Friday went by smoothly. Sorry to say, Saya didn't raise her hand. But Heidi Hopper did. Amazing! AJ actually whispered. Richie cleaned my cage. I tried to imagine him with a big black mustache, like his uncle Aldo. Later, when Mrs. Brisbane asked him to name the capital of Kentucky, Richie said, "Hot dog?" Everyone giggled, of course. Especially Stop Giggling Gail, otherwise known as Gail Morgenstern. "Repeat that, please, Richie," said the teacher. Richie realized he'd made a mistake, so he tried again. "Frankfurter?" he said. More giggles, explosive giggles. "Try again, Richie," said Mrs. Brisbane, who was on the verge of smiling herself. Frankfurt," he said proudly. That was the correct answer, by the way. So, you see, it wasn't exactly a bad day in room 26. It's just that I was jittery, wondering what would happen to me when the bell rang. Would I be left alone, hungry, utterly forsaken for 2 whole days? Or would I be a captive in the haunted house of Mrs. Brisbane? At last, the bell rang, and the students flew out of the door like a flock of homing pigeons in a movie Miss Mack showed us. Just then, the room mothers stopped by. One was Heidi Hopper's mom, and the other one was Art Patel's. That's pay attention, Art. They came to talk to Mrs. Brisbane about Halloween, which was less than 2 weeks away. I didn't know what Halloween was, but it sure sounded scary, especially when they talked about bringing bats and witches, and even worse, cats, right into the classroom. Shiver, quiver, shake. What could they be thinking? I was about ready to fling open the door of my cage and escape when the door opened and in walked the principal, Mr. Morales. Mr. Morales is the most important person at Longfellow School. He runs the place and everyone respects him. You can tell. For one thing, Mr. Morales always wears a tie. No one else in the whole school wears a tie except Mr. Morales. For another thing, when Mr. Morales comes into the room, everyone stops what they're doing and waits to see what he has to say. And for a third thing, both Miss Mack and Mrs. Brisbane sometimes threaten to send a misbehaving student to Mr. Morales' office. As soon as the teacher mentioned the principal's name, the student would start acting very, very nice. "Good afternoon, ladies," said Mr. Morales. He was wearing a light blue shirt and a tie that had tiny books all over it. Everyone said, "Hello." "Well, how's your first week back, Sue?" he asked. Sue was apparently Mrs. Brisbane, although I'd never actually thought of her having a first name before. She said it was great to be back and what a wonderful class it was, which obviously pleased the room mothers. Then Mr. Morales leaned over my cage and smiled. His tie dangled right over my head. "I'll bet you're enjoying this furry little pupil," he said with a grin. I expected Mrs. Brisbane to tell him what a trouble-making rodent I was, but instead she forced a smile and said, "Well, yes, but he's quite a bit of extra work." Mr. Morales waved a finger at me. He didn't seem to hear what Mrs. Brisbane said. "I always wanted one of these fellows," he said, "but my papa wouldn't let me have one. Sure is cute." Mrs. Brisbane cleared her throat. "Yes, but I'm afraid he's a little distracting. I was going to see if Mr. Kim in room 12 wants him." I was shocked. Luckily, so were the room mothers. "Oh no, the children just love Humphrey," said Mrs. Patel. "Heidi talks about him all the time. And it's a wonderful way to teach the kids responsibility," Mrs. Hopper said. "Yes, but it's a little too much responsibility for me," Mrs. Brisbane sighed. "At least I have a couple days away from him this weekend." "You're not taking him home with you?" asked Mrs. Patel. Mrs. Brisbane backed away from the cage. "Oh, no, it's out of the question." "But Miss Mack always took him home," said Mrs. Hopper. "He'll be fine. He has plenty of food," Mrs. Brisbane answered very, very firmly. The room mothers were silent a second. Mr. Morales was still wiggling his finger at me. Then Mrs. Hopper spoke up. Why don't the kids take turns bringing Humphrey home for the weekend? They can sign up, we'll talk to their parents, and give them instructions. It will be a great experience. Some people might not want him, said Mrs. Brisbane. Squeak for yourself, Mrs. Brisbane. That's fine, said Mrs. Hopper. There'll be plenty who will. I think it's great, Mrs. Patel agreed. I'd take him today, but we're going up to the lake for the weekend. Oh, I'd take him too, said Mrs. Hopper, but we're painting the house and the place is a mess. Next week for sure.